Good morning, class and students. This is Vivek Birda, your faculty and coach for the subject business environment. And we are again over there for the new topic. So we are moving to the next topic for this session, in which it is privatization and the disinvestments. We will be covering the following topics under this. The first is the expansion of the public sector and its effects, the way of the privatization, the obstacles to the privatization, conditions for the success of the privatization, benefits of the privatization, arguments against privatization, sins and pitfall of the privatization, privatization and disinvestments in India, and then we'll conclude this topic. So remember, or better to understand, a strong reversal of the trend of the statist economic expansion set in globally since around the 1980s and has become the hallmark of the new wave of the economic reforms that has been sweeping across the world. The privatization means transfer of the ownership and or management of an enterprise from the public sector to the private sector. It also means that the withdrawal of the state from an industry or the sector partially or fully. Another dimension of the privatization is opening up of an industry that has been reserved for the public sector to the private sector. Privatization marks a change from dogmatism to the pragmatism and amounts for the reversal of the policy. Thus, the expansion of the public sector and its effects, regardless of whether socialist or market-oriented, a large number of countries in the 1960s and 70s saw expansion of the public sector, and in particular, an expansion of the state-owned enterprises across the board formed. In the 1960s, there was a trend towards nationalization in Britain, but since the late 1970s, a trend was followed privatization of the state towards the enterprise SOEs. It intended to become a universal trend. The performance of SOEs in many performance of the SOEs in the many countries was by and large being far more satisfactory. They often put large burdens on the public budgets and the external debts. The heavy financial burden imposed by the SOEs and the growing public discontents against them due to their inefficiency, indifferent, irresponsible, and sometimes even arrogant attitude, and the lack of the concern of the customer needs, and the corruption, nepotism, and the splendor associated with their organization and the management led to the growing interest in the privatization. As a professor, Sam Pauls points out that in country after country, unbridled state expansion has led to the economic efficiencies in the production activities of the public sector, with the high cost of the production, inability to innovate, and costly delays in the delivery of the goods produced. Thus, the ineffectiveness in the provisions of the goods and services, such as failure to meet the intended objectives, divergence of the benefits of the allied groups, and the political interference in the management of the enterprise's end. Third, the rapid expansion of the bureaucracy severely straining the public budgets, causing problems in the labor relations with the public sector, inefficiency in the government, and the adverse effects of the whole economy. These problems have led many governments to undertake the programs of the public sector reform and pushed up by the need of the corrupt public expenditure to reevaluate the possibilities for shifting the publicly managed activities into the private sector. Thus, the privatization reaction, even in the communist countries, privatization becomes a vital measure for the economic rejuvenation. It may be noted that as a result of the privatization, the number of people owning shares in the Britain almost tripled from 7 to 20% of the adult population between 1978-89. Interestingly, in 1988, Britain experienced a symbolic crossover. For the first time in history, more British citizens were holders of the shares than were the members of the unions. Further, as the portion of the shareholders in the total population, the increase as an economic lot of the workers and the poor improves, leftist parties increasingly lose their grounds. In 1988, for instance, the Labour Party in Britain lost 8% of its members, the biggest exodus since 1981. The way of the privatization, there are different ways of achieving the privatization. Each country has its own gimmicks. In Britain, the staff of the privatized companies have priority in buying the shares and are entitled to discount. For instance, 96% of the British telecom companies took share of their company in defiance of the trade unions' oppositions. Although some of them later sold them at a higher rate, they derived certain benefits, at least financial ones, from the privatization. Thus, the use of the US ESOPs, that is Employee Share Ownership Plan, practice in another interesting examples. ESOPs provides for the forming special funds which take banks credit to buy the company's shares and distribute them among the employees at a real value or free of charge, as the credit is paid back out of the company's profit. One of the important way of the privatization is disventure or privatization of the ownerships, thus through the sale of equity. In countries where there are well-functioning capital market, this entails selling stocks of the public. In the industrial countries, privatization has come mainly through the disventure of the government economic activities. There are large number of cases where the privatization has taken the form of denationalization or deprivatization. A considerably large number of enterprises were denationalized in the countries like Chile, Bangladesh, and Pakistan. Another way of privatization is contracting. The governments will contract out services from and have planned their and specify to the another organization that produce and deliver them. Franchising authorizing the delivery of the certain services in the designated geographical areas is common in the utilities and the urban transport. Contracting is common in public works, defense, and many specialized services where supplies compete for the contracts and there is no loss of the economies of the scale. Contracting is efficient, but there is a scope of corruption in contracting, and the long-term contracts lead to the encouraged monopolistic behavior by the private suppliers. Another option for the government is to withdraw from the provisions of the certain goods and services, leaving them wholly or partially to the private sector. Thus, privatization may also take in the form of the privatization of the management using leases of the management contracts. Following, the government can share the burden of liquidation, which can either formal or informal. If the formal liquidation involves the closure of the enterprises and the sale of the assets, under the informal liquidation, a firm retains its legal status even though some of its operations may be suspended. Thus, the obstacles to the privatization. When compared to the industrial countries, the progress of the privatization has been slow in the developing countries. As the World Bank points out, the government confronts several obstacles like those mentioned below when they decided to disinvest SOEs. Thus, the governments usually want to save the least profitable enterprises, those that of the private sectors is not willing to buy at a price acceptable to the government. This venturous trends to arouse the political oppositions from the employees who may lose their jobs, from politicians who fear short-term employment as a consequence of the liquidation or the cost reduction by private owners, from bureaucrats who stands to lose the patronage, and from those sections of the public that fear of the national assets and are being concerned by the foreigners, the rich, and the particularly ethnic group. Sometimes the opposition of the employees is due to the fact that they have to bid goodbye by the ease-going culture in the public sector and produce result if the enterprise is privatized. Thus, a relatively underdeveloped capital market sometimes make it difficult for the government to float shares and for individual buyers to finance the large purchases. Thus, the conditions for the success of privatization. Professor Simon Paul points out that if the privatization is to be succeed in the sense of raising efficiency and effectiveness in the production and delivery of the goods and services, the following 7 conditions must be met. First, privatization cannot be sustained unless the political leadership is committed to and unless it reflects a shift in the preferences of the public arising out of the dissatisfaction in the performance of other alternatives. That the privatization has in the past worked best when the government was strongly committed to a change or when the new government vowed to reverse the actions or its procedures as happened in the Chile and the United Kingdom. Some governments that have faced severe economic crisis with the massive budgetary deficits have turned to privatization and disventure as the part of their adjustment strategy. Second, any alternative institutional arrangements could any alternative institutional arrangement chosen should not stifle competition among suppliers. Replacement of the government monopoly by the private monopoly may not increase publicly welfare, thereby multiplicity of the private suppliers. This can be a difficult problem where there were few competent suppliers. Through government may wish to contract out a service if there are only 1 or 2 qualified contractors. The benefit of the competition are unlikely to follow. In this context, the most likely developing countries' systems of the regulation need major review and reform. Over-regulation of the industry discouraged private initiatives. Over-regulation of the urban land use of the building construction retreats urban development, and unduly low ceilings of the prices of the industrial products and the utilities, such as bus transport, electricity, inflate demand and depress the incentives for the production. Third, a related condition in the freedom of entry of the program to provide the goods and services is the long-term contracts in the franchisee limits competition and the consumer choices. In some services that are capital intensive, the freedom to entry is difficult to achieve. But in others, but in others, such as refuse collection of the health services, the public will be better served by the several private suppliers competing that as one of the agency monopolizing the market through the long-term contract. Fourth, the public services are to be provided by the private sectors and must be specific to have a measurable outcome. The physical construction or the utility services, for example, can be measured, but most of the educational services and the police protection are not easy to quantify, even though their inputs can be measured. But the lack of specificity make it more difficult to control the services provided by the private sector, especially if the public serve it is illiterate, unorganized, and unassertive. Thus, the service delivery by the non-government organizations by the local governments may be more appropriate under these conditions. Fifth, the consumers should be able to link the benefits they receive from services to the cost they pay for it, since they will then shop more wisely for the different services. Thus, the user charges are one way of establishing the link. The importance of educating the consumers and disseminating information to the public cannot be overemphasized there. Sixth, privately provided services should be less susceptible to fraud than government services, and if they are to be effective, services provided through collective or the cooperative actions at the community level are probably the least susceptible to fraud. Seventh, equity is an important consideration in delivery of the public services. Broadly speaking, the benefits of privatization can accrue the capital owners who supplies the services to the consumers who receive more efficient services, and to the public at large through the reduction in the public sector deficit and hence in the taxes or at the rate of the inflation or both. Thus, the privatization will be the counterproductive if the ability to the public to pay, determined by the public income distribution, becomes the sole guide of delivery of the services, and if the benefits of the privatization are likely to be reaped solely by the local elites, expatriate groups, and the multinational corporations, the political resistance to reform is likely to increase. Thus, the benefits of the privatization benefits the society in various ways. For example, countries like UK have shown how it could benefit to resolve the financial crisis of the state to assure the new industrial democracy. The benefits of the privatization may be listed down as follows. First, it reduces the fiscal burden of the state by relieving it of the losses of the SOEs and reducing the size of the bureaucracy. Second, the privatization of the SOEs enables the government to mop up the funds. The government of the India's budget for 2000-2001 proposed to raise 10,000 crore during the year through the privatization is the achievement. However, what dismal as the privatization plan could be carried out in the real earth during the various reasons. Third, the privatization helps the state to trim the size of the administrative machinery. Fourth, it enables the government to concentrate more on the essential state functions. Fifth, the privatization helps accelerate the pace of the economic development as it attracts more resources from the private sector of the development. Sixth, it may result in the better management of the enterprises. Seventh, privatization may also encourage entrepreneurship. Eighth, privatization may increase the number of the workers in the common man who are shareholders. This could make the enterprise subject to the more public vigilance. Thus, the arguments which are against the privatization, some of the important arguments against the privatization are as follows. The public sector has been developed with certain notable objectives, and the privatization means discarding them in one stroke. Privatization will encourage concentration of the economic power of the common determinant. If privatization results in the substitution of the monopoly power of the public enterprises by the monopoly power of the private enterprises, it will be very dangerous. Because the privatization many a time results in the acquisition of the national firms by foreign firms, and the privatization of the profitable enterprises, including the potentially profitable, means foregoing the future streams of the income for the government. Sixth, privatization of the strategic and the vital sector is against national interest. Seventh, there are well managed and ill-managed firms both in the public and the private sector. It is not the sector that matters, but the quality and the commitment to the management matters. The capital market of the developing countries are not developed enough for efficiently carrying out the privatization. Ninth, privatization in many instances is half-hearted measures and therefore it is not properly carried out, with the result that the expected results may not be achieved. Tenth, in many instances, there are vested interests behind privatization and it amounts to the deceiving the nation. The UNDP Human Development Report of 1993 observed that in many countries, privatization offers have been a garage sale for the favored individuals and the groups. Thus, the sins and the pitfalls of the privatization. Privatization does not guarantee unconditional success. Privatization in many countries are being found to be often fraught with many sins and the pitfalls. Thus, the commonly observed flaws of the privatization are as follows. First, the lack of the proper strategy. An important reason for the failure of the privatization in absence of the proper strategy or the forms regarding the industries units to be privatized. The method of the privatization extend to the disinvestment, selection of the buyer, investors, etc. Second, ambiguity of the objectives. The real objective of the privatization is another problem. It is for raising the revenue. Is it for making the enterprise competitive? Or it is there for multiple objectives? What is the priority list? Third, the convenience. Sometimes politicians have hidden objective behind privatization. That the UNDP report cited that it can point out that in too many cases it has been taken place for the wrong reasons, under the wrong conditions, and in the wrong way. Fourth, wrong timing. Many privatization schemes could not get the good price because of the wrong timing. The good price can be obtained if the privatization is done when the performance of the market capitalization and the industry prospects are good. It is pointed out that the Maruti could have got a good price had it been privatized when the goings were good. Fifth, the lack of political consequences. The privatization is a political process too. As there are opposing views regarding privatization, there are likely to have some oppositions of privatization. In privatization, Balco is the case in point. The government shall try to be clear the need for and the objectives of the privatization and shall bring out a board of consequences if possible. Sixth, wrong labor strategies. Most public enterprises have surplus labor, getting rid of which is essential for the success of the enterprise. But to overcome the labor resistance to the privatization, often unrealistic promises are given that the labor will not be affected by the privatization. A more often and realistic handling of the labor is needed for making the privatization meaningful. Thus, the prospects of retraining and redeployment of the labor are yet to be properly explored in the countries like India. Seventh, the lack of political will. Privatization is not carried out in the real, earnest and properly because of the lack of political will and or vested interest. For example, some ministers oppose privatization of the enterprises under their ministry and some politicians oppose the privatization of undertakings in their constituencies or states. Poor financial strategies. Many privatizations are carried out without a good financial strategy. Ninth, wrong environment. Mere transfer of the ownership does not help improve the performance of the enterprise. Where the market functions poorly and enterprises are still vulnerable to the arbitrary government edicts, transferring ownership to the private sector is unlikely to achieve much more. 10th, prevalence of the monopoly elements. If the privatization results in the convergence of the public sector monopoly to the private sector monopoly, the privatization may not produce much beneficial effects. It could even worsen the situation. That the problem of the cultural change, improvement of the performance of the enterprises after the privatization will depend inter alia or bringing about the change in the work culture and the total enterprise culture. And this is also not easy task. And then privatization versus disinvestment in the India or the disinvestment in India through. Although there were some isolated cases of the privatization, no definite policy decisions were taken until the new economic policy has assured it. The disinvestment policy, the policy of the government on the disinvestment has evolved over a period. A brief account of it has been given in the chronological order. In the initial phase, the disinvestment policy as enacted by the Chandrasekhar government in the interim budget of 1991 was to disinvest up to 20% of the government equity in the selected PSCs in favor of the public sector and institutional investors. The object of this policy was stated to be broad equity, improve management, enhance availability of the resources and to these PSCs and yield resources to the exchequers. The industrial policy statement of 24 July 1991 stated that the government should disinvest part of its holding in the selected PSCs, but did not take place any cap on the extent of the disinvestment, nor did it restrict the disinvestment in favor of any particular class of the investors. Thus, the objective for the disinvestment was started to be to provide the further market discipline to the performance of the public enterprises. However, the budget speech of 1991-92 reinstated the cap of 20% of the disinvestment in the eligible investors. Universe was again modified to consist of the mutual funds and investments institutions in the public sector and the workers in this fund. But the objective two were modified, and the modified objectives begin to raise resource, encourage wider public participation, and promote the greater accountability. Thus, in 1993, the Government of India set up a committee of disinvestment in the public sector enterprises under the chairmanship of C. Rangarajan. The Common Minimum Program of the United Front Government 1996 sought to carefully examine the public sector non-core strategic areas and to set up the Disinvestment Commission for advertising onto the disinvestment related matters or to take up and implement the decisions to disinvest in the transparent manner and to ensure the job security opportunities for retraining and redeployment. No disinvestment objectives was, however, mentioned in the policy statement. Thus, the pursuit of the above policy of the United Front Government, the Disinvestment Commissions was formed in 1996. It made recommendations of 58 PSCs. The recommendation indicated a shift from public offerings to the strategic trade sales with transfer of the management. The second phase, it is the first budgetary pronouncements in 1998-99. The first government decided to bring down the government sharing holdings in TSUs to 26% in generality of the cases, thus facilitating the ownership changes, and was recommended by the disinvestment commissions. It, however, stated that the government would retain majority holdings in PSCs involving strategic considerations and that the interests of the workers and would be protected in all the cases, and policies for 1999-2000 and enriched the government into the budget speech. Next is the strategic and the non-strategic classifications. On 16 March 1999, the government classified the public sector enterprise into the strategic and the non-strategic areas for the purpose of the disinvestment. It was decided that the strategic public sector enterprises would be those in the areas of the arms and the ammunition and the allied items of the defense equipments, defense aircrafts and the warships. Atomic energy, except in the areas related to the government, to the generation of the nuclear power and the application of the radiation and the radioisotopes of the agriculture, medicines and non-strategic industries and the railway transport. All other public sector enterprises were to be considered non-strategic. For the non-strategic public sector enterprises, it was decided that the reduction of the non-strategic public sector, it was decided that the reduction of the government stake to the 26% would not be automatic, and the manner and the pace of doing so would be worked out on a case-to-case basis. Thus, a decision in regard of the percentage of the disinvestment, that is the government stake going down to less than 51% or to the 26% would be taken through the following considerations: whether the industrial sector requires the presence of the public sector as a countervailing force to prevent concentration of the power in the private hands, or whether the industrial sector requires a proper regulatory mechanism to protect the consumer interest before public sector enterprises are privatized. As the highlights of the policy for the year 2001 were that of the first time the government made the statement that it was prepared to reduce its stake in the non-strategic PSCs even below the 26%, and it was what would be increasingly emphasis on the strategic sales and debt over there. Then the Rangarajan Committee, the recommendations of the report of the Committee of the Disinvestment of the Shares in the PSCs, Rangarajan Committee submitted in the April 1993, emphasizes the need of the substantial disinvestment. The committee suggested that the percentage of the equity to be disinvested could be up to 14% for industries explicitly reserved for the public sector. It recommended that in exceptional cases such as enterprises which had a dominant market share or where the separate identity had to be maintained for the strategic reasons, the target public ownership level could be capped at 26%. That is, the disinvestment could be taken to the extent of 74%. In all other cases, it recommended that 100% disinvestment of the government stake holding of 51% or more equity to the government was recommended only for six scheduled industries, namely coal, lignite, minerals, oil, arms, ammunition, and defense equipment, atomic energy, radioactive minerals, and the railway transport. Other important recommendations of the committee include the following. The best method for disinvestment is offering of the general public to the fixed prices through the general prospecting. However, since these shares have not been traded so far on the stock market and it was difficult to decide the fixed rate at which it should be offered to the public. Once the reasonable time has been elapsed, our normal trading and the atmosphere established in the market, this indeed would be the best method. Till then, the auction method with the wide participation may be adopted. Second, instead of the year-wise targets of the disinvestment, a clear auction action plan should be evolved. Third, thus the disinvestment shall be in stages and shall be staggered so as to get the best possible price. Four, the number of steps needed to be undertaken for efficiently carrying out privatization. These may include corporatization of the public enterprises, restructuring of the finance with the proper debt equity gearing, and on independent regulatory commissions for the concerns connected. Fifth, a scheme for the preferential offers of the shares to the workers and the employees may be devised. Sixth, a 10% of the proceeds of the privatization may be set apart for lending to the public enterprises on the concessional terms of meeting their expenditure and the rationalization needs. Thus, the Disinvestment Commission for the United Front Government and the Government of India constituted the Public Sector Disinvestment Commission on 23rd August 1996 with the following broad purpose to the reference. First, it helped to draw the comprehensive overall long-term disinvestment program within 5 to 10 years for the PSUs referred to in by the core group. Second, to determine the extent of the disinvestment, either total, partial, indicating the percentage increase of the PSU. Third, to prioritize the PSUs referred to by the core groups in terms of the overall disinvestment program. Fourth, to recommend the preferred models of the disinvestment, that is the domestic capital market, international market, market auction, private sale, to identify the disinvestors as others for each of the identified PSU and to suggest the appropriate mix of the various alternatives taken into account of the market conditions. Fifth, to recommend a mix between the primary and secondary disinvestment, taking into account the government objectives, thus relevant PSUs, funding requirements, and market conditions. Six, to supervise the overall sale process and take decisions on instruments, pricing, timing, etc. as appropriate. Seven, to select the financial advisors of the specified PSUs to facilitate the disinvestment process. Eight, to ensure the appropriate measures which are taken during disinvestment. Thus, the process to protect the interest of the affected employees, including the encouraging employees' participation in the sale process. Nine, to monitor the progress of the disinvestment process and taking the necessary measures and report periodically to the government on such progress. 10th, to assist the government to create the public awareness of the government disinvestment policies and programs and with a view of developing the commitment by the people. 11, to give wide publicity to the disinvestment proposals so as to ensure large public participation in the shareholding of the enterprise. 12, to advise the government on the possible capital restructuring of the enterprises by marginal investments, if required, so as to ensure the enhanced realization through the disinvestment. Thus, the Disinvestment Commission is an advisory body, and the role and the function would be to advise the government on the disinvestment in those public sectors units that are referred into it by the government. The Commission shall also advise the government on and other matters relating to the disinvestment and may be specifically referred to by the government and carry out the other activities related to the disinvestment as may be assigned by the government. The commissions have recommended the disinvestment at the varying levels for a number of PSUs, for example, MFI, GAIL, Actuarial, Conquer, EHL, ENT, HCL, RICL, RHO, UHO, and NALCO. Strategy sales in the various promotions have been recommended for many other enterprises like Balco, ITI, HTL, AICUL, ITDC, BRPL, MFL, HCL, SCI, EIN, EPIL, HPL, IBP, NEPA, NZL, PPCL, FACT, HLL, IPCL, MFL, and SAIL. Thus, the progress in privatization process begins in India since 1991-92 with the sole of the minority stakes in some PSUs. From 99 to 2000 onwards, the focus shifted to the strategic sales and the total receipts from the privatization in March 2013 amounted to 1,60,616 crore rupees. Thus, the evolution of the disinvestment policies. The policies of the disinvestment largely evolved from the policy statements of the finance minister in their budget speech. And in brief, this investment can be divided into three phases. First, in 1991 to 1999, when the focus was on the disinvestment of the minority shareholding in various financial institutions. In from 1999 to 2000 and to 2003 to 2004, since 2004 and 5, the focus is on the disinvestment of the minority stakes in the domestic companies to the general public in conjunction with the issue of the fresh equity by the company. The new government led by the BJP was assumed office on 26 May 2014 is likely to announce its disinvestment policy. Thus, we can summarize that the privatization, which has been a universal trend, means referred to the ownership management of the enterprises from the public sector to the private sector, but also means the withdrawal of the state from the industry to the sector partially or fully. Another dimension of the privatization is opening up of the industry that has been reserved for the public sector to the private sector. With the privatization is an inevitable historical reaction and to to indiscriminate expansion of the state sector and associated problems. Even in the communist countries, it becomes a vital measure of economic rejuvenation. The society may benefit from privatization in several ways, and it could help to reduce the fiscal burden of the state by relieving it to the losses of the SOEs and reducing the size of the bureaucracy, enable the government to mop up the funds, result in the better management of the enterprise, encourage the entrepreneurship, and help to accelerate the pace of the economic development as it attracts more resources from the private sector for the development. Thus, the privatization may increase the number of the workers and the common men who are shareholders, and they could help the enterprise sector to be more public vigilance. Privatization enables the government to conclude more and more of the essential state functions, and thus the important ways of the privatization are as follows: by disventure or privatization of the ownership through the sales of the equity. Second, by the denationalization or the reprivatization. Third, by contracting under the government contracts or who contract out services to the other organization. Fourth, by franchising, authorizing the delivery of certain services in the designated geographical areas as is common in the utilities and urban transport. Fifth, government withdrawing from the provisions of certain goods and services, leaving them wholly or partially to be under the private sector. Fifth, privatization of the management using leases and the management contract. Seventh, liquidation, which can be either formal or informal. The formal liquidation involves the closure of the enterprise and the sales of the assets. Under the informal liquidation, the firm retains its legal status, even though some of its operations may be suspended. Thus, this is all for the today's class. Thank you, students, and I hope you have enjoyed the session. Please stay connected. For any doubts and queries, you can connect back to me on email ID vivek.management@tmi.ac.in. It is your faculty host mentor for the subject business environment. Thank you. Good day.